Our final speaker, thanks Jake, our final speaker is Christine Milne, the Green Senator from Tasmania and spokesperson on climate change. She's also the Deputy Leader of the Australian Greens. She was until recently a Global Vice President of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. She's also one of the few Greens in this country, Green politicians, ever to have actually served in government. A remarkable experience when she was part of the Green Labour Accord in Tasmania. She's also, in my view, one of the most outstanding politicians to be elected to the Senate in this country ever for any party or of either gender. Please welcome Christine.
Well, thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. And I wanted to begin by, again, acknowledging that we are on Aboriginal land, and it's really important in thinking about bringing about change that we keep both feet very grounded in country. And it's that notion of connection to the environment, connection to country that has to be maintained at all times if we've got any hope of reaching a change that is both ecologically sustainable, peaceful and socially equitable. Having said that, I want to say that change comes about through guns, as in the shooting variety, or through politics. They're really your choices, through democracy or through guns. And we in the Green Movement repudiate guns and violence, and therefore it is through the political process in a democracy that change comes about. And I keep with me at all times that wisdom of Machiavelli in the 15th century, who said that, you shouldn't underestimate how difficult and dangerous it is to bring about a change in the order of things, because the vested interests who require the old order to stay fight like partisans, whereas those who believe in the new order are lukewarm in their support because people don't believe in new things until they've had experience of them. And that is precisely where we are at the moment in politics in Australia, in bringing about a Green New Deal, an ecologically sustainable future. Now, in a democracy, people are elected to make and amend existing laws to give effect to the best interests of the country. That's why people stand for politics. We go in there not to be campaigners. We go in there to change the law to give effect to whatever it is we want to change it to. And those laws, if they are to be sustainable in the long term, have to reflect the broad consensus of the society that is being governed. Otherwise, they will be rapidly changed back to where they were, so the changes will be short-lived. The balance is how you can use your position to go ahead or do something different from the community consensus and hope that people will get used to it over a period of time and it won't be changed back. And so, for example, John Howard's GST was brought in without a community consensus. People got used to it and they gave up the fight to ever get rid of it or go back to anything else. Whereas with work choices, it went against the consensus and people organised and fought strongly, and it was ultimately changed, but not to where it needed to be. It was modified, let me say, so that it was marginally better, but it didn't go back to where it needed to be. So having said that, what we understand is that basically politics lags behind the broad consensus in the society, and politicians never do anything that they perceive is not consistent with what the majority might think. So there's not much courage. There's a lot of managerialism goes on in politics, and it's only when there's a disaster or a major event that they get a bit of courage. And so an example of that was the Port Arthur massacre, on the back of which John Howard did, in my view, the only courageous thing he did in his entire period in government, and that is bring in national gun law reform. But it was on the back of a shocking event which led to a community consensus for a short period of time, which gave him a window of opportunity to move, and he did, and I congratulate him for having done that on that issue. But apart from that, they generally don't go out with anything courageous in a leadership sense. And so what you need is political advocacy within the political process for the change, for the courageous change that can help to drive the new consensus. And so to bring about change in politics, it's a question of those who are trying to build a consensus for the change and those who are working hard to undermine and stop the building of a consensus or the achieving of a consensus for that change. And that's why we've got at the moment, you've got the unions, you've got the lobbyists and the vested interests, the churches, the media, the NGOs are all major players in this business of either trying to maintain the consensus as it is or to maintain a pretense of what is the community consensus versus those who are trying to break up those monoliths. And that is our way of changing, is to actually split the monolithic views that have previously been held by groups like churches, for example. And we're seeing that gradually, a split off of some of those churches into the more progressive areas, a split off of some of the more progressive unions, for example, and we are getting the NGO sector to be more active. But as Joan said, the thing is they have to be active and they have to be independent. And one of the things which the Labor government did successfully to maintain the existing or the status quo and undermine any building of a new consensus was take activists off the street through the ESD process. And most of you, or some of you, may remember the Ecologically Sustainable Development process, where they took activists off the street and into the back rooms and captured them and stayed there for a very long time. And that is the first thing that governments now do, is try and take the NGOs off the streets, out of the public arena, into the back rooms. And those who are led by the nose, we all know, and that's why they're increasingly ineffectual in the public arena. So once we break down the monolithic view of business, so we're getting some of the new progressive businesses, you're getting a few people in the media, some of the progressive unions, splitting up the churches and so on, but you still have to have political advocacy. And that political advocacy has to also be strategic. You are not going to bring about change without political advocates who are strategic. And one of the first things Greens at every level of government, local, state and federal, need to do is to be changing the system to enable the changes that need to take place into the future. So, for example, one of the things we desperately need to get back is an independent public service by getting rid of those top-end contracts and getting people onto permanent contracts in academia and in the public service, so that we get back the third-party referees and independent advice to government. They are critical changes. They don't sound very amazing, but they're critical changes if we're going to bring about the things that we are asking for. But the question is, if you didn't have Greens in politics, could Labor and Liberal do it themselves? Because there is a view around some of the NGOs that the problem is actually the Greens, that because they're there, Liberal and Labor are not accustomed or not wanting to bring about any of these changes because it will somehow advantage the Greens, and therefore they are blocking. Having Greens there is blocking real change. Well, you know, that is it's an interesting view, but of course what people fail to realise is that the Liberal and Labor parties are part of the vested interests of the past, because they grew out of a philosophical view that the earth had infinite capacity to supply resources and absorb wastes, and the question was only who should benefit from that exploitation and absorption of waste, whether it was capital or labour. There was no questioning of whether the exploitation of resources and absorption of waste was actually a given. And that is why they are incapable of actually shifting. They are part of the Machiavelli problem. They are part of the partisans who will fight for the vested interests of the past, because they don't have a philosophical view which is about sustainability in the future. So those NGOs who are captured by the past are going to go the way of the past. And that's why I think Joan's point about the most exciting thing in the NGO movement at the moment is this new spontaneous uprising of community activist groups around the country who are over all that, who don't intend to be captured and who are going for it. So I'm really excited that that is out there. So the role of the Greens, you are not going to bring about change in a democracy by just building a consensus of community movements. You can protest as much as you like. You can go to non-violent direct action. You can do as much as you like. You can even vote. But the problem is that as long as you've got a consensus view which holds a majority of numbers, you are not going to bring about change unless into that view you inject people who are political advocates for the new consensus that is being built, and where you have from local through to global a consistent philosophical view that can be articulated at every level. And we did not get, for example, a large shift on the debate on refugees until Bob Brown stood up on the Tampa. That is the reality. I worked in his office at the time, and in the first few days after his Tampa statements, we were deluged by abusive phone calls from one end of the country to the other. But within a couple of weeks, the local groups really came out strongly behind, and soon it became people were emboldened by it. People were led by it, they were emboldened by it, and it led to a shift in policy. The same with things like gay law reform would not have happened around this country without Green advocacy in the parliaments around the country doing it. And exactly the same for a range of other issues, and it is the same on climate change. If there were not Greens in parliaments around this country, there would be nobody talking about what the science demands, what the real challenges are, how dramatic the changes need to be, and so on. So politics is absolutely fundamental to the change that needs to be brought about. But it is a politics which relies on everybody working wherever they are to build the new consensus and having the courage and the confidence to go for it wherever they are. And that is, as Joan said, independent NGOs. It means new economic theory, as we heard earlier, to support people who are advocating for the new direction. It means linking up globally with those other people in other countries who are struggling in much more difficult circumstances than we are, as we heard from Hendro. We need to be linking up, and that is where the global Greens come in. And in Copenhagen, I can tell you it'll be the Green parliamentarians there, although not in government delegations, who will be working with the NGO sector to try to bring pressure to bear on the negotiations. That will not be coming out of traditional political parties. I can guarantee you that. So as a conclusion, don't be dissuaded when people come up with the kinds of things that we've just heard about, saying, oh, you know, we really want to bring about change, but we don't want to get involved in politics. If you don't want to get involved in politics, you don't want to bring about change. You want to feel good, you want to feel as if you're making a difference, but actually you're not going anywhere unless you are going to recognise that you either put a gun in somebody's hand or you put someone into a parliament who can add to the numbers to vote for the change. They are the choices. And so being involved in politics, in the new politics, in the politics of ecological sustainability is worthwhile work in the absolute definition of it, but it requires courage and it requires confidence. And that's what I would urge for you to get involved in the new politics of sustainability. Have confidence, have courage. Thank you.
I'm a little concerned about your tripartite model of democracy, of parties, political parties, and business and NGOs. It seems to me that it doesn't really fully recognize the concentration of power that we have in modern societies. For example, Noam Chomsky argues that the United States has a one-party system, a business party with two factions. And I suspect the same is true in Australia. So I just want to get your thoughts on the concentration of power that in the modern world that multinational corporations tend to make or break governments, make or break politicians. Now, the Greens may be an exception to that.
Thank you. It's a good question. What I have seen happen in the last 20 years is a whole series of work being done to implement a model of democracy in which those forces and powers have more and more power. And that whole neoliberal critique which has been imposed on us, and I talked about that drip, drip, drip of information, that attitude has been seeped into our consciousness. And I recognise the power of those forces, but what I am really looking for and what I'm dedicating myself to is to generate a concept within the NGO sector of a model of democracy which is different. And my way of contributing to that, to contribute to the weakness, to try and to weaken the influence, is to try to permeate our society with a model of democracy which restores a greater strength to that sector. And I can assure you I'm not unrealistic about the powers and the forces that are operating. For example, I've written on why it is over the last 20 years that all this has happened, and we haven't got time to go into that now. There's actually a book coming out in a couple of weeks' time which reassesses the Hawke legacy, and I've written the environment chapter in that, in which I've attempted to assess what are all the forces that have caused us to be where we are now. But my way of looking at it is that all of our good campaigning that we must do, recognising the power of those forces, needs to also be predicated with that we believe that the process is different. So part of that mass movement also needs to talk about the need for this different model.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, very good question, and I think it sets my position. I'm mainly campaigning on debt and economics, as most people here know, and I expect to fail in my campaign for the same reason I expect the Greens to fail, the Green Movement to fail in its campaign, because, again, the forces arrayed against us are enormous. So I'm expecting to fail and I'm still campaigning. Reason is simple. I'd rather fail creatively and be ready for what comes afterwards, because the forces we're talking about are irresistible, but there would be no point opposing them if they weren't also unsustainable. And we all know that. Okay? So you can expect to fail or turn the ship around before it starts to sink. But if then it starts to sink, at least you're ready to what's to be said in the aftermath. Now, one of the scariest books I've read, to give an idea of why this is so important, is actually a novel by Ben Elton called, I think it's called Blind Faith, or some title like that. He envisages a post-global warming world in which London is an archipelago, and so on. And the dominant philosophy is a combination of Rush Limbaugh, the religious right in America, and Britney Spears, with a dose of Paris Hilton on top. A Brave New World with 1984 with a capitalist expose everything you're doing, reality show focus to it. It's scarily possible. And that is the religious right-wing backlash reaction could be what we get after a global crisis if we're not prepared for an alternative analysis beforehand to say it wasn't done by God and it isn't the flood. So in the same sense in debt, I expect to fail in a campaign to turn the government around about economic policy until after such time as it's so obvious the system is collapsing that then you have an alternative analysis which can take over rather than one which might be fascist or just simply bad economics. There's plenty of that to go around.
Can I have the mic? I'm going to indulge myself as moderator and ask Steve a question. There's a tremendous amount of talk about grassroots activism. What interests me is the lack of intellectual leadership. And your very startling emergence during the GFC as an intellectual spokesman of another point of view. Where are the others? And do you know of any others in the offing? And why have there been so few until now?
I started campaigning on reforming economics in 1972 as an undergraduate student, slightly younger than you are, I think, now. And I realised at the time we were likely to win the battle at Sydney University, which we did, but lose the war in the sense that the financial forces that were building up at the time, levels of debt driving the economy, were likely to wipe us out and overwhelm us. So at the same time we won a political battle at Sydney University and lost neoliberalism globally. And in fact it was very poignant coming together of the two events in September 11, 1973, with the sacking of the Allende government in Chile, and the chief economic advisor at the time was Ted Wheelwright, my favourite lecturer. We had a lecture on that day about the experience. So you could see again the point you were making too about the peaceful, which Christine was making. The vested interests will fight in a dogged way, whereas the people who believe in a future aren't yet prepared to campaign that strongly. So I knew there's no chance of turning things around until the crisis arrived. And there was some luck in my timing. I wrote Debunking Economics in 2001 when I could feel I just had an enormous accumulation of intellectual evidence against the theory. I knew there was a chance to do it, and then I did that. And then when I came out with the debt, it was, again, I'd been modelling Minsky's financial instability hypothesis for 20 years. And again, I was ready to see the danger of that crisis arising. That's why I stuck my neck out. There are others, but I've had to number the people in the world whom I'm aware of who can contribute to developing an alternative, really contribute, not just, talk about how nice it'd be or go down a wrong track, but really contribute, be about 20 or 30. I know almost all of them personally. It's terrible that it comes down to that ultimately, but it often does, that you get a very, very small group who've got the combination of skills that are necessary. In Australia, strangely enough, we have probably one of the best concentrations of non-orthodox economists on the planet. At the same time, I've got some of the most rabid right-wingers on the planet. The IPA and places like that are distinctively Australian institutions. And the emphasis upon free trade, one of the great chimera's of the world, came largely out of Australian economists. And often they're very good people too. This is the bizarre thing. They're very well-meaning. They believe they're doing good. Okay? But there is a large group. So they do exist. So if you want to get in touch, there's a group called the Society for Heterodox Economics, abbreviation SHE, which meets every year in December at the University of New South Wales, and Peter Chrysler is the main organiser. There's groups like that. There are other non-orthodox economists like myself, Bill Mitchell in Newcastle University. We differ on some important points, but generally in the same side. So there are some people around. In America, you get people like Jamie Galbraith. In England, a guy called Paul Ormerod. There are a few people around, but it takes a strange combination of mathematical skill, historical knowledge, literature awareness and media savvy to stick your head up above the lot and get heard, and I happen to have that combination.
And a crisis.
And a crisis, which I was, there's a whole three, the ecological crisis, economic crisis and energy with peak oil. We have the three horsemen of the apocalypse. It's like a bad episode of Star Trek all at once.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much for a number of really thought-provoking talks there. But I've got a question for you, Steve. There is actually, or there has been at least throughout the 90s, a strain of ecological economics, and I'm recalling people like Michael Jacobs and Herman Kahn, a number of people who I believe are economists who've been trying to inject an ecological view into the discipline. Yeah. Apparently they've remained at the margins of the discipline. I'm just wondering if you're aware of their work and how much the work that they've done has imprinted into the discipline as a whole and how much it's informed your thinking.
Yeah, I'm quite aware of Herman Daly and colleagues. I've been reading their work for 30 years. I worked in Overseas Aid in an NGO. Freedom from Hunger campaign for 3 years as education officer, and we ran a library called the Ideas Centre where their work was a major input. So I'm aware of their work. It's been totally marginalised in economics. They have almost no impact at all. And if I'm a fan of any particular attempt to bring non-orthodox dynamic thinking into economics, it's really the limits to growth crowd. The Meadows and the systems dynamics groups, they did probably the most effective attempt to bring a form of thinking which is compatible with ecological thought into economics. And I just met just a couple of years ago with the Norwegian co-author of that book. There's now a 2004 update, which I highly recommend people reading. And he's got the same pessimism I've got. It's impossible to convince economists about it because as soon as you try to get them thinking in growth terms, they fall back into equilibrium every damn time. And like one person whose work I'm extending is the man called Phillips. You all heard of the Phillips curve? Okay. He was actually an engineer trying to teach economists how to model dynamically back in the 50s. Drew a little diagram showing a relationship like we call the Phillips curve today as part of an argument of a dynamic system model of the economy, which he'd done is two simulations of, one using a hydraulic system, the other using an analogue computer. Now, he gets derided for inventing what they call hydraulic Keynesianism. They didn't have a clue of how to understand what he was showing them. So this incredible mental barrier to understanding anything that relates to growth and feedback and cycles and so on. So I'm trying to find ways to fight around that. Herman Daly and friends have made a good impact on the young on the periphery of the profession, but they've really been completely excluded from the centre. And my feeling is the only way to get in there is to show them a way of doing dynamic thinking, dynamic modelling, that they actually understand and enjoy. And that's what I've been working on really behind the scenes in the last 3 years. Whether it'll succeed or not, I don't know. But until you get them to be able to think dynamically, they'll never be able to understand anything about the ecology, and they'll always push ideas like the limits to growth, small is beautiful, etc., right outside the centre of the citadel.
Yes, in the front here.
I'd like to comment a bit.
Oh, sorry. Hendro would like to comment first, and then we'll take that question.
Right. I just want to respond to Sal's observations. Maybe I didn't make myself clear, but actually we work not very closely, but we work together with women in developing, feminist sociological framework that's really local and all that, and basically. Revamping, basically, the explanations of his social ecological crisis. We work very closely with the National Commissions of Women, and when we do documentary and all that, we always, first of all, ask the women to speak up. I belong to the wrong, sex, but I work. No, I'm an ordinary member. I'm ordinary member of Women's Solidarity for Human Rights in Indonesia, and very actively working and in their daily basis and all this. So, and I think this disaffected. I think one of the key disaffected sectors of the society in Indonesia is exactly as you said. Women, youth, youngsters, and the rural populations. And there's no way whatsoever, the current framework, operating system, so that can deal with it. Just to respond quickly and link your questions to Steve's, nice explanations. I think it's something like we operate with the DOS, beta versions of DOS to tackle a neural network kind of problems. So this is the situation really, not only for Indonesia, but I believe also for the 42 countries in the Annex 1 countries. I mean, we deal with this complexity with DOS version beta. So that's our situation at the moment. Thanks.
Yes, Christine would like to comment, then I'll take one last question.
I just wanted to comment on the perspective of women in politics. Have a look at the women who we've elected to Australian politics. It is not just because of a certain gender that you have a certain philosophical perspective. It is actually a feminine perspective we want in all our representatives, whether they are male or female, because we have a number of women in Australian politics who do not have a feminist perspective at all. And, remember Maggie Thatcher? Just bear that in mind when people say the political process is going to change when you get 50% women. 50% women should be there because it is equal and appropriate that we have equal gender representation. But don't assume that all women are going to have a feminist perspective or all men don't, because I would argue that Bob Brown has a very strong feminist perspective and we need him there just as much as we need other women there.
I'm sorry to all the other questioners. Will you thank the panel?